Okay, good evening, everybody. It is 7 o'clock according to my time. I'm sure we're gonna still have some people filing in, but I wanna be respectful of everybody's time. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome to our on-farm dairy processing webinar. To start, my name is Alicia Drinky, and I am a dairy management specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock and Field Crops program. And this is a collaboration between Cornell University and the 5 CCE associations of Steuben, Allegheny, Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, and Erie counties. And I'm going to be serving as our moderator tonight. So just a couple of housekeeping items really quickly. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording within about a day or two. We are using a webinar format, so the only people that will have audio privileges are our speakers. So if you have questions, we will have a question and answer portion at the end of the presentations. Please submit your questions to the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you open up that Q&A box, you will see questions from other participants, and you can upvote or like those with the little thumbs up icon. And that will indicate to us that more individuals want that question answered, and we'll put it on higher on our priority list at the end. At the end of the webinar, you will also be directed to a survey in your web browser. It'll take about 3 minutes or less, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback as we do value it. And the link for that survey will also be included in the email that you receive with the webinar recording. So I would now like to introduce our main speakers for the evening. First, we're going to be hearing from Anika Gianforti, who is a dairy processing and marketing specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension's Harvest New York program. Anika is going to discuss some of the logistical considerations for on-farm processing. Then we're going to be hearing from Becca Durant, who is a dairy production specialist with the Department of Agriculture and Markets Division of Milk Control and Dairy Services. Becca is going to briefly cover some of the regulatory considerations for on-farm milk processing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and have Anika share her screen and hand it off to her.
Thank you, Alicia. So thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening. Really pleased to be able to talk to everyone on the call about dairy processing considerations. So especially in these strange times, we've been getting a pretty significant uptick in folks who are interested in dairy processing for a variety of different reasons. But to give you a little bit of background, I am a dairy processing specialist with Harvest New York, as Alicia mentioned. So a little bit of background there. Harvest New York is a Cornell Cooperative Extension program, and it's a statewide program that really focuses on agricultural economic development. So we have a pretty diverse team. For example, we have folks in New York City who are urban agriculture specialists. We have a local foods distribution specialist, a berry specialist, and we have 2 dairy processing specialists. So one of those individuals is me, and the other is Karen Ospina, who joined our team in December, and she is based out of the Hudson Valley. Another really great advantage we have as dairy processing specialists is the fact that we have a whole dairy foods extension group that's actually based right on campus at Cornell in Stocking Hall. So the picture on the right-hand side of my screen here is a picture of that team. And we have a really fantastic team, and between all of us, we managed to make sure that if you have a dairy processing question in New York State, you can get it answered between myself, Karen, and the rest of this great team here. So we're here to talk about logistical considerations for dairy processing. So it's really important to understand, why, if you are a dairy farmer, a producer, why would you want to get into a value-added venture? So when I talk to folks, there's usually several key reasons that motivate people to go this direction. One of them is current market conditions. So for the last several years, things have really been tough on the producer side of the dairy industry. So a sentiment I hear often is the milk price is low, we need to either differentiate or vertically integrate or do something to make this feasible in the long term. Another common component that I hear is making room for the next generation or family members who are currently off farm to come back to the farm. So creating room for that individual or individuals, both managerially and economically, is another common one. And the last one that I honestly hear probably the least frequently is passion. So the idea that I know I can create a great product, you know, I'm milking cows now, I do a fantastic job, I have really high raw milk quality, I know I can make a really good finished product to have consumers enjoy. So that being said, we really need to be asking ourselves, should the dairy farmer also be the dairy processor? And my answer to that is it depends. So maybe and maybe not. So some of the key things we really need to consider if you are a producer and you're looking to do a value-added venture is whether or not you're prepared and committed to a different set of skills than you would normally be using on the dairy farm. And there might be some overlap here, but they are quite different. So skills for success in dairy processing. These are my four main ones that I usually talk to folks about when they tell me they're interested in dairy processing. The first is marketing. You know, we as a dairy industry largely move towards a cooperative system for raw milk handling. And the reason for that is we got together and we said we really need someone to market our milk for us on the finished product quality side. So, you know, determining how you're going to do that on an individual scale takes know-how, marketing know-how, a lot of time, the motivation to do it, and then it's also logistically challenging. So I'll dive into that a little bit more. The other thing is processing knowledge. So understanding what it means when the pH drops in your product and you're trying to make it, understanding how to make a high quality product, because ultimately, if it doesn't taste good, no one's going to want it. The third thing is really understanding regulatory and food safety requirements. And this is something that's becoming more and more critical as time goes on, both from a regulatory standpoint and from a customer standpoint. I'll dig into that a little bit more. And then the fourth thing on the list overlaps with a lot of these other factors, and that's time. It's our most precious commodity. Time is money, and there's never enough of it. And this really folds into these other components as well, and I'll touch on that and where those time sinks really come in. So jumping really quickly back to marketing. So we really need to address the fact that the statement, if you build it, they will come, is a myth. So, you know, if you're interested in processing your milk on farm because, you know, you've had family members and neighbors say, you know, I really wish you were making your own products, that's a handful of people. So understanding that you need to put a strong effort in to break even on a processing venture is something that I really can't state strongly enough. So planning for who and where your market is going to be something that's critical, especially looking at where you are in New York State and what the population density is in that area. Another thing I hear really commonly in rural areas, in particular in New York, is that they have a seasonal business that has the potential to be really strong. So those seasonal businesses can be really, really valuable, but we need to take a close look at that and say, all right, what is the true market size of that seasonal business? And can that sustain you for the off season as well? So for the entirety of the year. And then who exactly is doing the marketing? So if you would rather be spending time in the barn with the cows than with other people, you're going to need to tap somebody else on the shoulder in order to do the heavy lifting of a lot of that marketing for you, whether that be talking to other wholesale customers, different retail customers, but really doing all the door knocking and stuff like that, because that takes a tremendous amount of time. So I really can't stress how important that marketing component is. And then we have, you know, kind of back to a marketing 101 concept. When you're doing your business planning, one of the things that I often see be pretty ambiguous is some basics around these 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. In particular, the product. A lot of times we get phone calls and we have folks who are saying, you know, what do you think we should make? You know, we have a ton of raw milk, but what do we do with it? And truthfully, I don't have the answer to that question. You know, I can point you in the direction of what categories are doing in general in New York and across the United States, but that's something that really needs to be determined by the business owner. And it's really important not only for your business plan, but also for figuring out your processing facility and what that's going to look like and how large it needs to be to identify what product or products you want to make, what you want them to be packaged in, and all those different components, because that can really impact how your facility is designed. The other thing is price. So commonly, if you are with a cooperative now and you want to start processing your own product, that milk is under contract. So the traditional way that they would handle that would that you'd be actually be buying back your milk from the cooperative. So when you're determining your price, you really need to talk to the co-op, figure out what the deal with that is, because that's going to be your input price. And then you need to determine, how much are we going to pay ourselves for our own milk on top of that, or how are we going to handle that? So determining price is going to be really particular based on what you want to package that product in, what price point you think consumers in your area are going to be willing to pay for that type of product. But that's certainly an important component. Place. This is where we can get into a lot of different logistics, and a lot of times when I talk to folks, it's kind of a combination of, a lot of times it's the case of I want to have a farm stand, but I also would be interested in selling to retail customers. And both of those are great, both of those are fine ideas, but if you only have retail customers and there's only a handful of grocery stores in the area that you've approached, you really need to do a lot more digging into that to figure out how much volume you can expect to move through those different places and how much it's going to cost you to get there. So a lot of times we've seen startup businesses start up and they're really happy to get accounts, but they might be driving a couple hours to service a relatively small account, and it ends up costing them more to get the product there than that product is actually worth in terms of value. So we really need to consider those trade-offs when determining where that product is going to be marketed. And then promotion. So that kind of rolls in all of those different marketing components and figuring out what your individual marketing pitch is to those consumers. So what are you offering the consumer that is a niche? So logistics, going back to the concept of how much it costs to get product places based on where you are at geographically, do not underestimate the amount of time that takes and how much value there is in that, because you're going to need refrigerated transportation 9 times out of 10 to bring that product from point A to point B. You're going to need someone to drive the truck, and it might not be able to be you. You might be busy doing other things. So do not underestimate how much time the logistics of delivering that product to your customers is really going to take. This is just a quick screenshot of the 2010 census data of population density across New York State. So, even in rural areas like in northern New York, we have dairy processing facilities, but folks have identified unique ways of marketing their products. So, we see really dense areas in the lower Hudson Valley, New York City, certain parts of this I-90 corridor. But this is just something I like to point out because no individual business is going to be the same. If I have someone calling me from Eastern New York and someone calling me from Western New York or Northern New York, their situations may look totally different. So there's no one-size-fits-all plan for marketing. It really needs to be unique to that business in that location. So moving on to processing knowledge, there's 2 key components here that are the most important. One is, does it taste good? Even a lot of these new products that are developed that are high protein, low fat, and have all the bells and whistles in terms of consumer buzzwords, it still needs to taste good. That's something, we're lucky we have in the dairy industry, we have a great product that has a lot of components built right into raw fluid milk that we can, process it into cheese, yogurt, and a lot of different really, really fantastic products. But getting your recipes right for individual products is more challenging than you may think. In figuring out the different nuances of your equipment, figuring out how to actually make that product into something that tastes really good. And if you do get to this stage and you're testing out different recipes, don't just ask your close friends if they like your product. Really go out and do a little bit, more formal market research, because your friends are not going to want to hurt your feelings and tell you that they don't like the product. So I'd really encourage folks, if they're dipping their toe in the water to this, to do some market research here, because it can be really valuable. And the second really important thing is that food safe. So food safety and regulatory considerations and customer requirements are becoming more stringent. So when I say customer requirements, these are requirements that, just to give you an example, a retailer like Tops or Wegmans or Whole Foods may be asking for food safety documentation that goes above and beyond what the regulatory requirement is asking of you. So it is, something that you need to think about if you're interested in entering the retail market. Are we prepared to take on these schemes that we need to follow as far as food safety goes? And a lot of times, you want to be creating a safe product, but the requirements take a lot of documentation, they take a lot of planning, and you have to actually execute what your plan says that you're going to do. And you will get audited against that. So food safety is becoming an increasingly important area of focus. So as far as processing knowledge goes, we have some key recommendations here. First thing is get training before you're breaking ground on your facility, because a lot of times we'll have folks who come through the training after they're already halfway through their facility design, and they'll say, I really wish I took this before I made my plans and had them all set in stone. Also, if you have the capability, test your recipes at a processing plant. So there are processing plants across the state that may be willing to do some co-packing of a product for you. At Cornell, we have a food processing development lab where we can rent equipment, and you can test out recipes that way. And that's something that we'd highly recommend, and you can troubleshoot a lot more easily that way. And these facilities are licensed facilities, so you'd actually be able to sell that product and get your toe in the water before you actually build a whole plant and try to figure out on your first day of processing. And then the third, understand the regulatory requirements at the state and federal level. So when I have an initial phone call with folks who are interested in entering the value-added business, one of the first things that I recommend they do is reach out to their area inspector. So Becca will be talking a little bit more about the regulatory requirements in a few minutes here, but that's something that I can't say it enough, is before you break ground and before you build a plant, make sure you look into some of these different things. So food safety, digging a little bit more into that, kind of a question for the audience that you can ask yourselves at home is, have you noticed more food recalls in the news in the last several years? And if you're answering yes to that question, there's a couple different things going on. So food is not becoming less safe, but it is really quite a bit easier for us now to track down the source of these food outbreaks, those foodborne illness outbreaks. And this affects companies of all sizes. So it's not just large companies that have foodborne illness outbreaks and get people sick and potentially can lead to death. It's also small companies. And unfortunately, we've seen that happen in New York State, in the Northeast, and we do not want that to happen to a processor who starts up. And we want to avoid that. So it's really important that you understand the food safety requirements before jumping with both feet into the value-added business. So some stakeholders that are influencing this, there's state regulatory agencies. So again, Becca will be speaking afterwards. The federal regulatory agency that oversees dairy processors is going to be the Food and Drug Administration. So they have the Food Safety Modernization Act is the most recent food safety legislation that was passed back in 2011. And that did modernize a lot of the requirements that food facilities are required as far as documentation and training of employees and things like that go. And then, as I said, customers really, really want food safety assurance, because your retailers don't want to be pulling product off the shelves that consumers of their locations purchased. So I can't stress that enough, how big of a component it has become for business planning and the success and longevity of a business, because we've seen businesses fail due to food recalls. Going along those same lines, just to drive this point home a little bit more, the Center for Disease Control has a database called PulseNet. And PulseNet uses whole genome sequencing, so it's kind of like a fingerprint, a DNA fingerprint of bacteria that are found from folks who have become ill. So for example, if I was feeling ill and I ended up going to the hospital and the doctor wanted to see exactly what I had, they would take a sample and they would figure out exactly what organism made me sick. And they would take a DNA fingerprint of that organism and load it into a database. Now, if the FDA or a regulatory agency came into my facility and swabbed a floor drain or a tabletop, and they found that exact same organism, it would link right up in that database to that illness. So this is something that is really useful for a public health tool, but it also means that food companies need to be more on top of their game than ever before when it comes to food safety. So ultimately, it drives a lot of continuous improvement. No one gets in this business to have food safety issues. We definitely want to avoid that. But it's something that I think is important to let folks know about. So whether you're a small company, a large company, a medium-sized company, this can affect everybody equally. And going back to that time component, so now that I've probably scared everybody a little bit with food safety concerns, you probably realize how important it is from a documentation and a sanitation standpoint to make sure you have all of your ducks in a row. So there's a lot of time that goes into this from a marketing, production, and record keeping end of things. So this leads me to say that dairy processing is not a part-time job. If you're interested in getting into it, it's a totally separate business venture than dairy farming. You really need dedicated personnel that are handling all of the logistics around your dairy processing business. So, you know, maybe you have upper management that is involved in both aspects of the business, and that certainly makes sense, but you really can't expect someone to be both on the farm side and on the processing side and do it successfully. Other business considerations just to point out here before I switch it over to Becca. Make sure that you understand your cooperative's requirements as far as dairy processing goes. So I always encourage folks to touch base with their cooperative before doing a value-added venture. Also, I mentioned this earlier, but consider co-packing as an option, especially if you're just starting up, and that allows you to become a little bit more familiar with your market, and you can develop your business on that side of things. And then if you wanted to build a plant down the line, you could certainly do that, but you wouldn't be putting up a really large capital investment for a market that you're unfamiliar with. If you do decide to build a dairy processing plant, you really need to make sure that you're building a dairy plant and not just a processing room. So whether you're building from scratch or you're trying to retrofit a current facility, you need to make sure that you build in space for what you need. So don't forget a room for a sanitary entryway. When you enter a dairy plant, you need to follow certain hygiene requirements, and a lot of times you have dedicated footwear, dedicated clothing that actually stays in that processing facility. So having a place to actually handle all of that is important. Place for product retention. So if you're making fluid milk, you're going to want to keep some fluid milk back in a refrigerator to do some sampling. You may need to do antibiotic sampling, so you need a little space for that. Packaging storage is something that we see get overlooked quite a bit. Same thing with cleaning chemical storage and refrigerated storage. So if you're only processing a couple days a week, you know, when you're starting out, you're going to need a little bit more refrigerated storage to be able to, you know, deliver throughout the week or whatever the case may be. And then room for growth, which ideally you would grow. And we see people have issues in the long run. So poor facility design can make or break a business. And in terms of the actual infrastructure of the building, if it's not done well, it will lead to potential food safety issues. And this is something that we've seen. You know, materials are going to be really important. And Becca might get into that a little bit more here, but this is stuff that we would rather talk to you about this before breaking ground than have you build a plant and reach out to us afterwards and have us say, oh, we really wish you could have done this when you were building. Just a couple more things. The type of products you want to make has a really strong influence on the facility design and size of that facility. So for example, if you want to make milk in glass bottles, which is a trend that we've been seeing quite a bit, you're going to need a lot more space to actually store those larger bottles and wash the bottles. So bottle washers are not small pieces of equipment, so planning for that is important. So when we talk about identifying the specific product in your business plan, that's important for these implications as well. Another thing that we see, you need to make sure that you get cleaning chemicals that are specifically formulated for dairy processing. So when you're processing product, you're oftentimes heating that product, and that's going to create protein residual on your equipment. And one of the key ways to avoid food safety issues is proper cleaning and sanitizing. So you really need to go with chemicals that are specifically formulated for dairy processing environments and not just milking parlor chemicals. And then some products may require a scheduled process. So if you're trying to make something really unique, it might not fall in any particular spot as far as regulatory requirements go. And we're going to want to see that the process that you would use to process that product would actually make a safe dairy product. So you may require some additional scientific background on that side of things, which we can help folks with. So as far as Cornell goes, we do have a lot of resources and workshops that can help you in endeavors like this. So I would certainly encourage you to reach out to us if you had questions. You can either reach out to us through the Harvest New York website or the Dairy Foods Extension website. And we do have a lot of classes. And I don't want to take up too much time. So I am going to jump over to Becca, and we will have a few minutes to answer questions afterwards.
Okay, whoops, do I know what I'm doing? No, I do not. Thank you, Anika, and good evening, everybody. And as I try to get, there it is. All right. So, as Anika said, I will be covering the regulatory perspective very briefly tonight, but again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you get a lot of useful information out of this. So the dairy business in New York is regulated by the Department of Ag and Markets, and we are the Division of Milk Control. The map is a division, or shows our regions that we're split up in, and each region has a supervisor. The names of the supervisors and their phone numbers are on this map. And if you decide to go ahead with a dairy processing facility, you would call the supervisor in your region and start asking questions, and we would go from there. So for example, if you are in this big green region, which stretches from Madison County up to Canada, you'd give me a call. And the first thing I would ask is what product you were thinking of, and also what species, if you're cows, cow milk, goat milk, sheep milk. And then I would send you a bunch of regulations, probably the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, which we call the PMO, the Part 2 processing regulations, which are New York State regulations, and then some hopefully useful information lists, things you should really think about when you want to process. The second thing I do is tell you to get to know your Cornell Dairy Extension team. We work very closely with Cornell. They have awesome training. I highly recommend it before you really do anything as far as spending money on a dairy plant. And the third thing I would tell you is to go to every small processor that will let you in the door and spend some time with them. See how much time it really takes them to process, and see if you really think you have time to run a farm potentially and run a processing plant. It's not an easy thing to do successfully. I also recommend that you talk to people about the mistakes they have made and the things they would do differently if they had to do it over again. Because I think if you can learn from their mistakes and maybe take a tip or two on saving time, saving money, and saving yourself stress from each of the places you visit, I think it's well worth the effort to do. So how will we do our best to help you when you call me? So after you've done some research, you're going to come up with a general plan, and we'll go over it with you and suggest some directions, maybe point out some things you've forgotten to think about. And then we'll review the regulations that pertain to your particular product that you think you want to make. We'll talk about the permits, which there really isn't a lot to. It's not, our permit is not something that would keep anybody from starting a business. The equipment can be difficult to find, especially small scale. If it's something in New York that you're looking at, we can take a look in person. If it's in one of our plants that maybe is selling something, I can talk to another supervisor or another inspector and make sure it's okay. Out of state, in particular, out of the country, can be a lot more difficult, and we try to guide you in asking for details on if that equipment will pass regulatory inspection and actually be useful to you when you get it. We will visit if you have a couple of buildings you're thinking about retrofitting, we will come and look. If you have a site, particularly on a farm setting, you want to be careful where you put your dairy plant. You want a clean entry to that plant. You want clean air coming into that plant, so it can be tricky to properly site your building if you're building something new or if you're retrofitting an older building. Label review, we will review your labels for you when you're that close. And we'll also tell you how often to expect us to come and visit once you're up and going. Basically, every 90 days we do plant inspections. Every 90 days we do pasteurizer testing. And every month we come and test your finished product for bacteria. So you'll see quite a bit of us. So some of the paperwork we require, the two things that everyone has to have are a Part 2 processing permit. This is only, I believe, 2 pages, and it doesn't cost anything, but that's the permit you need to be able to process milk in New York State. And every plant also has to have a processing plant superintendent. We call it a PPS. And that's the person who is 100% responsible for everything that happens in that plant. So you may be the owner of the plant, but not actually work in the plant very much. So you'd want the person who is working with the pasteurization, the packaging, the record keeping. That's the person you want to be the processing plant superintendent. And that doesn't cost anything either. The milk dealer's license, you only would need if you are going to process over 3,000 pounds of cow's milk a month. The wholesale frozen dessert license also costs money, just those two, milk dealers and wholesale frozen dessert. But the cost is based on value. So if you're a small plant, that isn't anything that should break your budget at all. Milk receiver's license is something you might need if you take samples or transport official samples. And every food plant now has to register with FDA under the Bioterrorism Act. So that's I believe, every 2-year registration. We have an Ag and Markets homepage, which was recently redone. So I believe if you get on the homepage, find the Division of Milk Control and get to Milk and Dairy, there's a section called Dairy Businesses, and that will help you. It has downloadable forms. It's got the regulations. So that's something that can help you if you're further interested in this. Probably the most important thing when deciding on your plant is what product you're going to make. If you don't want to buy a pasteurizer, the only thing you can make is raw milk cheese. All raw milk cheese has to be aged at least 60 days. And lots of times a better high-end cheese is aged a lot more than that. So obviously, if you don't have to invest in a pasteurizer, the initial cost is less, but your return will take a long time before you get anything. And you've got to hold all that cheese for at least 60 days. You just won't get any money back for quite a while, depending on how your cheese actually turns out after 60 days. Everything else, the fluid milk, the yogurt, any fresh cheeses, sour cream, cottage cheese, butter, ice cream mix, which I forgot to put on, all those can be made once you have a pasteurizer. So a pasteurizer is definitely more of a financial burden initially, but it allows a lot more flexibility in what product you want to make. So even though the Part 2 permit is very short and very easy, what we do have, which will take a lot more time and thought, are the applications. The DMC 1512 will only be applicable if you put in a high temperature short time. The 1517 is only if you're going to build a new milking facility. But everyone who wants to build a dairy plant will have to fill out the 1505 application. And it says it's to install or modify dairy processing equipment, but essentially it's a plan for your entire plant and all of your products. So it really makes you think about how you will do things and write it all down, and then we will go over it very thoroughly with you and make sure we're all on the same page, basically to make a safe product. So the first thing I want to say is to put everything down in writing, get it to us before you start construction. I have had someone build a small cheese plant without ever telling anybody, and they ended up having to rip up their floors and separate their restroom septic from their plant waste. So I don't ever want to have to do that again. So please let us know before you start construction. So the DMC 1505, as I said, really makes you think about what you're planning on doing, your product, how you'll make that product, how much, any flavors, what sizes, the ingredients you'll be using, how you have to store those ingredients, how you add those ingredients. And the facility construction, obviously, is the first thing a lot of us start with. Building materials, you can't use wood. That does leave a lot of possibilities. But basically, everything has to be washable, cleanable, blocking water. You want to keep things dry. And as Anika said, there's a lot more to a plant than a processing area. There is your raw milk receiving. You want to keep your raw and your pasteurized areas separate. So you've got raw milk receiving, you've got raw milk, potentially raw milk storage. You've got dry storage where you're going to keep your bottles, your chemicals, your ingredients. You can, like say for plastic bottles, you may have to buy a half a trailer or a trailer load of plastic milk jugs. And that can take a lot of room. It's got to be clean, it's got to be dry, it's got to be fly tight. So think about that before you go and try to build anything. Utilities, your hot water, your boiler, that's got to be separate from your processing. You will need a lab, quite more than likely, if you're using cow's milk, to do some Appendix N animal drug residue testing. It doesn't take up a lot of room, but it does take up room. You'll need a restroom. And as I said before, your septic for that restroom has to be separate from your plant waste. So there's a few things to think about there. Water, your hot water and your cold water, you want to be able to wash more than one thing at once without running another room in your plant out of water. So make sure you have enough. Separate rooms for things. If you build a plant and it's just the right size for you to bottle fluid milk in plastic jugs, and suddenly you call me and say, oh, by the way, I've decided to change to glass, that's when I tell you you've got to have a separate room for your glass bottle washer. So either that cuts down your processing area or makes you add on to the plant. So understand what you need separate rooms for and how the flow should be from, for a safe product. Ventilation is not something a lot of people think about, but then again, if you're washing with very hot water or processing, there's a lot of steam, humidity, water in dairy plants, and you don't want rain in your dairy plant possibly contaminating your product. And you need to have enough room for your equipment. You need a toilet, you need hand washing facilities at assorted different places in the plant. And your processing equipment really depends upon your product. Again, it's really important. What will you make? Is it fluid milk? Is it creamline milk? Is it 1%, 2%? Is it flavored milk? Yogurt, cheese? All of those have different requirements. Some require more equipment than others. Some are fairly simple. Packaging and labeling. As I said, labels are kind of towards the end when you have everything pretty much ready to go. Finished product storage. Say you have aged cheese. That can be hard to get your temperature and humidity right to get the right flavor in your cheese. And finished product distribution. Anika talked about that. How are you going to get it where it's going and in a good, safe manner and still cold where people want to buy it? So the plant layout with food safety in mind, your traffic flow has to be from low risk to high risk. The high risk product is your finished product, your ready to eat food. You want to keep raw separate from pasteurized. You want to try to keep a dry environment. Listeria and other pathogens tend to like a more moist environment. So with that in mind, you want to be very careful about where you put your drains, how you slope your floor, where you put your equipment, where you put your hoses. So that is an important consideration with food safety. You want your product, your finished product, to be very safe. You want to eliminate any potential post-pasteurization contamination. You want to limit access to essential personnel. Keep people in the raw room from going directly into your pasteurized room. And another big one with FSMA is allergens. So if you have ingredients, you need to know, milk obviously is one of the allergens, but if you have other ones, you need to know how to control cross-contact. So those are all the things you need to keep in mind to fill out this application for a dairy plant, the DMC 1505. And the first thing we ask you to do is a process narrative. And that's essentially a story of how you will make your product, what equipment you'll use, what ingredients you'll use, when they will be added, your temperatures, your times, your storage temperatures, everything you can think of, write it all down. It really gets you thinking about exactly what this will entail. Your detailed plans of the flow. Now, this application is used for Kraft and Hood and all the big plants too. So for a small plant, all we really need is drawings on graph paper, drawn to scale, and you can use colored pencil to draw the direction of the flow, the different rooms, your sinks, your drains, where you want to put the equipment. It does not have to be anything computer generated. This particular slide makes it sound a little more complicated than it needs to be for a small plant, but it is very important to determine the flow of your plant. A list of equipment, you know, you're going to be looking around. You're going to be telling us, asking us, is this piece of equipment approved? Is that piece of equipment approved? And we'll do our best to help you along and tell you what to ask. And I also want to stress here that all of your equipment, including your utensils, your storage bins, your pails, it all has to be food grade. So please make sure you're shopping at dairy supply stores, restaurant supplies, food service supplies, rather than Lowe's and Home Depot and TSC. In New York, if you're doing any welding, and a lot of small plants really don't have a lot of welding done, but if you do, make sure you use someone who is registered with our department. If you have someone that's a good stainless steel welder, you can easily have them register with us, and you can go ahead and use them in your plant. So when you get this all filled out, what do you do with it? You send it to the supervisor of the region that you're in. The supervisor and the inspector will do a review. We'll write down questions. We will very rarely approve the first draft of a plan. Earlier this week, I was up north and we visited a man who I think he was on his third version of the drawing of his plant. But the plant at the time, or the building currently, is being used for storage. So, but once we got on site, one of our big problems was that he had his finished product coming in through his raw receiving room and into the cooler, which opened into the raw receiving room. When we got there, we realized that he had a large overhead door that he wanted to leave there to facilitate bringing in containers. But that blocked him from doing his flow the way we wanted. After two and a half hours of really talking, walking through it, talking everything over, we ended up agreeing to change the location of the cooler doors, and ended up with, he still had his big overhead door, and we had him going directly from processing into the coolers without ever having to go near the raw receiving room again. So we will work with you. We will go on site, and when everything is very, very close, we will approve the plans, and then you can go ahead and start construction. So for that, when you're thinking about your processing and your product, you need to make a step-by-step procedure, a list of ingredients, what equipment is used for that product, and again, your processing parameters, your time, temperature, pH. And the process authority is if there's something odd, like carrot ice cream, we've run across some odd things, and when we do that, we call Cornell and ask, can this safely be added to a dairy product and made into a safe final product? And they will let us know. I don't know if I've mentioned it specifically, but it's a really good idea to have an office in your plant because there is a lot of paperwork involved. Your Appendix N records, those are the antibiotic records. You want to keep track of all your inspections, all your sample results. For fluid milk, you might have vitamin results. We've got water samples. Your food safety and environmental monitoring plans. Under FSMA, you may be technically exempt because of your small size, but many customers ask for food safety and environmental monitoring. So if you're going to start a dairy plant, just plan on having those included. So under FSMA, there's a lot of documentation involved, and yes, you will need it for a lot of your customers. And some of it is not that complicated, like GMP training, good manufacturing practices. With the coronavirus, it almost seems like the media would have everyone think, hand washing is something new, and it isn't. Basic hand washing, proper hand washing when needed, is a good manufacturing practice, and it always has been. So, I mean, it's very simple. The hazard analysis, you have to understand that you're making a product that is consumed by a wide variety of the population, including young kids, basically all ages. So where maybe your product isn't exposed to the environment at a certain point when you're filling or when you're adding ingredients. So you need to know what possible hazards exist, and you need to control them. FSMA is much more proactive than reactive. So you need to understand your product and understand the possible hazards. The recall plan, you may think that when you have your plant, you will never ever make a mistake and have to recall a product, but it may not be your mistake. It may be a supplier who ends up having to recall an ingredient that you've already put in your product. So you have to recall your product because of that supplier. So just a few basic regulation type things. Water supply, do you make sure you have enough water? That's really, really basic, enough to wash all the equipment that you have. Is it a private supply? If so, it's got to be a proper location and construction. We do take samples every 6 months on private wells along with recirculated water. Equipment has to be thoroughly cleaned after each use and sanitized. Storage tanks for raw product have to be emptied every 72 hours, so take that into account. How much milk will you be storing in your plant? It's not that the milk ages out after 72 hours, it's that the tank has to be emptied and cleaned. Talking a little bit about raw milk cheese, it has to be aged a minimum of 60 days above 35 degrees. It has to be identified. We sample raw milk cheese monthly for listeria because it is known. We have had a number of positives in the state, and it's not the safest product. Back when I first came on with the state, aged cheese was basically sharp cheddar, which is tart, old, crumbly. It's fairly safe. But if you get into a more mild, softer cheese, it can be inherently dangerous to make. I put this in here so I could show you the wooden boards. They are allowed in cheese aging rooms, but you do have to have a SOP for cleaning those boards on a regular basis. Also, you've got to have a way to identify all of these cheeses so we know what date they went in and what date they can come out. Pasteurization. There's vat pasteurization and there's high temperature short time pasteurization. Vats are by far the more popular, particularly for small processors. Your basic time and temperature is 145 degrees for 30 minutes. It's also called batch pasteurization because you're going to put a certain amount of milk in the vat, you're going to process or pasteurize it, then you're going to process that. Then you're going to wash the vat and then process another batch. You're not going in and out of this while it's pasteurizing. High temperature short time pasteurization, on the other hand, is also called continuous pasteurization. The minimum temperature is 161 for 15 seconds. And this is a nice little simple one. So raw milk goes into the balance tank. Back here, which is hard to see, are some plate heat exchangers. There's usually a regenerator, a heater section, and a cooler section. After it goes through the heater section, it gets up to at least 161 degrees. Then the milk flows through these tubes. The speed determines how long they're in the tubes. It has to be at least 15 seconds. And then it flows through a flow diversion device, which is controlled by the recorder controller. If it's still hot enough when it reaches the ends of the whole tube, end of the whole tube, it can go on to your filler. So basically, you're continually feeding raw milk into the balance tank. It comes out the other end as pasteurized. So it's continuous flow. Cooling, I put this in here because one thing people who do fluid milk sometimes have trouble with is you have to fill the bottles when the milk is below 45 degrees. And your well water may not be able to cool that milk down below 45 degrees. So you may need a glycol chiller. You may need just an old bulk tank with very cold water in it. You may need some other way of getting that milk cold enough to bottle below 45. Now, if you're doing yogurt, you can fill packaged yogurt warm, and you've got a certain amount of time to get it down below 45 degrees because it's part of the process. Packaging, I put this in here because you can't hand cap things. You've got to have mechanical capping, mechanical filling. But it doesn't have to be very complicated. This is just a basic small bottle filler, one at a time. The bottle goes under here. There's usually a foot valve, allows the milk to fill up the bottle. It goes over here, and there are caps that come out of here, come down here. They're at an angle. The bottle slides through, the cap snaps on. That's all there is to it. So for small plants, I really think sizing it correctly is probably the biggest problem. If you think you're going to get bigger but start small but have a big vat pasteurizer, each pasteurizer has a minimum and maximum legal volume that they can use. You may not have enough milk initially to be able to use that pasteurizer. On the other hand, if hopefully you're a success and you're growing and you're making more and more product, but your plant keeps getting crowded, and that can really make a food safety issue. So raw milk storage, are you processing every day, every other day, once a week? How much time do you have? How much room do you have? I really do think sizing is probably the biggest issue, but I've been around for over 30 years, and there's a lot of very, very nice small scale processing plants out there. So it is definitely doable. But one of the things is I would say communication is key. Keep in touch with us. We will answer all of your questions, and we will try to give you as much guidance as we possibly can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Becca, and thank you, Anika, both for your presentations. We're gonna move into our question and answer section right now. For those of you that do have to jump off, we are going to be sending you the recording tomorrow, and we do appreciate you joining us. We are just gonna take a couple of minutes though. So the first question is, are there any sample small processing plant layouts maybe available online for producers to look at and get a sense of?
So go ahead, Becca.
Go ahead. Well, Anika may know of some, I don't, but that's why I suggest people visit other plants, because it really depends on your product. And I think people who are in the business would tell you how they would have done it differently, and you can learn from them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the other thing is, while it may be helpful to get an idea of what everyone, other people have done, it's equally important to look at your own process, because, you might be in a situation where, let's say you're dealing with milk crates, for example, you're taking fluid milk and you're bringing milk crates in and out of your facility. How you handle those milk crates and where they go into the plant needs to be different than where you have, high risk products like ready to eat products, around your facility. So I'd really encourage you to look at more of it from what is my process going to look like, and how can I, make my facility design in the best and safest way possible from a food safety standpoint. So it might be helpful to look up some of those, but I would really encourage you to think that through and feel free to reach out to us.
Great. I'm going to direct the next question to Becca first. Could you address a little bit about selling raw fluid milk? I know you touched on raw cheeses a little bit, but are there additional considerations for selling fluid raw milk?
In New York State, we do allow the sale of raw milk with a raw milk permit. It has to be sold on the farm. And we do inspections monthly. We do sampling monthly. We do pathogen sampling of the milk. We require a sign to be posted in the milk house that it's raw milk for sale. It does not include the protection of pasteurization. We require a quality milk herd survey yearly and before startup. So yes, it is possible. There is a permit process for that. So I would contact your local inspector for that.
Great. And then do you know either what the recommended or required ventilation rates are, and is there additional considerations for incoming fresh air does that have to be filtered or conditioned in any way, or is there a resource where folks could find this information about ventilation requirements for plants?
Really, you need enough ventilation so you do not have condensation. So it really depends on your process, on the size, on the ceiling height. You would want to honestly contact an HVAC expert, depending on the size of your plant and your process.
Yeah, and one of the things that is going to be really important is, especially for like cultured products, is you're going to want to make sure that you're not bringing in yeast and mold spores into the facility through ventilation. So ventilation is important from a quality standpoint as well. So one rule of thumb, and every facility is going to be different, but 6 air exchanges an hour is one of those numbers that is thrown around quite frequently.
Perfect. When you get to processing, do you need an additional inspector for your milk room or your milking routine or anything like that?
It depends on if you're still shipping milk to a co-op or an independent, then the inspector you already have would be doing your farm. The milk control inspector would be doing your processing plant. If you are using all of your own milk in your processing plant, you're what we call a producer dealer, and the milk control specialist would be inspecting both your dairy plant and your dairy farm.
Perfect. And then we have a question here. If there are any self-containing processing sort of pods that are manufactured and approved for New York State, that maybe you could just kind of buy a whole unit and bring it to your farm and utilize that for dairy processing?
Well, when you think about what we talked about, your dairy plant is more than just your processing room where your pasteurizer and your filler, or your cheese molds, or your cheese press, your table. It's more than just that. You've also got your dry storage area. You've got your cooler space, possibly freezer space, depending on what you're making. You've got a restroom. You've got clean access to the plant. You've got your utilities. You may have to have a lab. You want to keep your raw receiving separate from your finished product room. So when you take all of those requirements into account, where will you find the space? I mean, you have to find the space somewhere. So you've got to look at it individually and see what you need, but include all those other spaces. It's not just a processing area.
Great.
Great, and I guess the only thing I would tack on to that is just because something is being sold as like a self-contained processing unit doesn't mean that by default it passes New York State regulatory standards. So again, everything needs to be treated individually.
Perfect. And then are all of the requirements listed in that CFR, or is there any other place that individuals should look for requirements?
The pasteurized milk ordinance has a lot of the requirements, and it's relatively easy to read because it has the requirement, and then it has the reason, and then it has what they call administrative procedures, I think it is. But it basically gives examples of how to meet the requirements. Our part 2 is essentially identical to the PMO, except it's written more in legal terms. It's not quite as easy to slog through all. It's much shorter. But basically, those are the places to go for the requirements, pretty much. The standards for dairy products can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR 21 sections, I think 131 and 133. But for the sanitary requirements, that's where the PMO and the Part 2 would come in.
And you can download the PMO online for free, and you can, it's handy because you can search by word and things like that.
Great. And is there a minimum amount of milk that a plant needs to process? Like, for example, is 50 gallons a week too small to process, or is it really just dependent on what works for that farm?
The smallest pasteurizer I've ever had is a 5-gallon pasteurizer. The people had 2 cows. So no, there is no minimum requirement.
And then are you able to process your milk and also retail it right on your farm?
Yes, a lot of places, especially in recent years, have been doing like a farm store with a viewing window to their plant, so people can actually kind of see what they're doing. And a lot of them sell their own product plus other local products, like in their little farm store. Agritourism kind of spot to local businesses are highlighted, and yeah, they can.
Is there any sort of regulation on how close or far away that the animals need to be from the processing facility on a given farm?
There's no distance set in stone, no, but like I mentioned earlier, you want clean access to your plant, and you want clean air in your plant. So you really need to look at individual setups for that.
And again, yeast and mold issues can be a problem there. You have different forms of bedding, and those yeast and mold spores will travel via air. So
great. Do either of you have a sort of cost approximation for starting out a plant? The person asked specifically about 40,000 pounds per day, but if you have any sort of cost estimates, that would potentially be helpful.
So off the top of my head, I guess I don't have a straightforward answer to that, but when you're looking at that much milk, you're going to be looking at a high temperature short time unit versus, well, probably or likely, depending on the product that you're making, likely a high temperature short time unit. And that's going to come along with a lot of additional requirements. So, and it depends on what type of product you're making, fluid milk versus cheese and yogurt. Those all have different considerations and equipment inputs and needs. So we'd have to give a better estimate by talking one-on-one, I think.
And then are there rules for skim milk, whey, and fat disposal? Like, do you have to follow any sort of nutrient management plan, or how does that all work?
Other than it being separate from a toilet, a septic, you can put it in a tank and dispose of it somewhere. It may depend on, you may have local rules that you have to follow, but we don't really have something specific as far as disposal of waste.
Yeah, you would need to work with your local municipality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and there are still a few questions left. So does raw milk processing for any product, fluid, cheese, or ice cream, follow the same regulations as pasteurized options, or are there additional considerations? Specifically, are there additional requirements for the cows, like additional brucellosis or TB testing?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but you can't make, the only thing you can make from raw milk is raw milk cheese. So you cannot make yogurt, you cannot make butter, you cannot, no. The only thing you can make is raw milk cheese.
And in that case, it would need to be aged for a minimum of 60 days before it could be sold.
Great. And are there requirements for transporting raw milk to a processing center?
It has to be transported in a sanitary manner. Now, obviously a bulk truck works. We've had people take an older bulk tank, put it on a trailer, seal up the openings, and use that as a transport tank. We've had people use stainless steel totes for transporting, or you can use a tote with a disposable liner, and you can still use milk cans. The trick with transporting milk in a tanker or say a stainless steel tote is that when they're washed, they have to be washed in an enclosed building. So you have to build something big enough to wash whatever you're transporting the raw milk in.
A little bit similar along those lines, can you pasteurize the raw milk as it's being harvested and then store it in a tank after being processed?
Yeah, go ahead, Becca.
You can pump the milk directly from your bulk tank into your plant if it's close enough. I'm not sure what the setup would be, I guess. And then pasteurize. Yes, you can store pasteurized milk in a pasteurized dedicated tank. You don't have to pasteurize it and bottle it immediately. If that's the question, I'm not sure if I'm understanding that completely.
The struggle is if you were doing a batch pasteurization, if you're thinking of like as the milk is being harvested, you have a continuous flow of raw milk coming in. In the case of a vat pasteurizer, once you start pasteurizing, you cannot have milk coming into that system. So that needs to be completely closed off. So figuring out what to do with that other milk as it's being harvested. So that'd be really difficult to do from that standpoint. And if you were to have a high temperature short time unit, that continuous flow pasteurization system, the trick there would be you'd have to have continuous flow and you'd need to have a certain level of milk in the balance tank that would be able to feed that HTST unit. So certainly logistical challenges there depending on how specifically that would need to be set up.
Great. And it is 8:14, so I'm going to ask our final question to be respectful of everybody's time. Could you address modifications to an initial approval? Like, for example, if you have a 1505 approved and operating, and then you decide to add some additional equipment or any sort of other products to that?
Absolutely. You're not locked into your ostensibly final plan and drawing. But that's where the communication comes in, because if you change something that you think is minor, like a plastic bottle to a glass bottle, it really could result in a major change in your plant. So communication, we're available by email, by text, by phone, and don't ever leave us out of the loop, I guess would be my answer.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for all of your knowledge and your time. I know there was just a couple of additional questions that people had, but we will be sharing out this recording as well as the slides and the contact information for both of our speakers. So please feel free to reach out to them. They're here to help, and thank you for joining us. And we hope you have the best of luck in your operations.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.